"That is not a car," Charlotte Pierce said, her voice sharp enough to travel past the cameras. "That is a warning sign." The laughter started near the velvet ropes and moved across the entrance of Pierce Motors like a match catching dry paper. It was supposed to be a night of progress, the grand unveiling of America's newest luxury electric sedan, a polished silver machine waiting beneath silk in front of reporters, investors, city officials, and every person in Columbus who believed the future belonged only to people who could afford it. Charlotte stood beneath the white lights in a tailored cream suit, her blonde hair smooth, her expression perfect, her company pin shining on her lapel like a small piece of armor. She had spent 18 months building this moment. She had rehearsed every answer, every smile, every pause. Then Mason Walker pulled into the front parking lane in a faded brown hatchback that looked as if time itself had tried to retire it. The front bumper was mismatched. The paint had surrendered in patches. Rust spread along the doors like old scars. One headlight was clearer than the other, and the rear window carried a small sticker that read, "Ellie's Science Club." A valet stared at it. A photographer lowered his camera, then raised it again for the wrong reason. Derek Sloan, Pierce Motors' chief financial officer, stepped beside Charlotte with a grin polished by cruelty. "Someone tow that thing before it leaks history on our pavement." More laughter followed. Mason did not answer. He shut off the engine, climbed out slowly, and walked around to open the passenger door for his 8-year-old daughter. Ellie Walker stepped out holding a cardboard science display against her chest, her brown hair tucked behind one ear, her shoes clean but worn at the toes. She looked at the crowd, then at the car, then at her father. "Are they laughing at us?" she whispered. Mason knelt just enough to straighten the corner of her poster board. His hands were rough, marked with old grease that soap never fully conquered, but his touch was gentle. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly. "They are laughing before they understand." Charlotte heard him, and for 1 second something in his calm irritated her more than any insult could have. Men usually defended themselves around her. They competed, explained, exaggerated, performed. Mason did none of it. He only took Ellie's hand and guided her toward the scholarship registration table as if dignity did not need permission to enter through the front door. "Sir," a security guard said, stepping in front of him, "this entrance is for invited guests." Mason reached into his jacket and handed over a folded email confirmation. "My daughter is presenting in the Youth STEM Showcase." Derek leaned close to Charlotte and murmured, "Apparently the future has arrived with duct tape." Charlotte gave a small, cold smile, but her eyes had drifted to the hood of the rusted car. There was something odd about it. No smoke, no shake, no rough idle. For a vehicle that looked ready for a junkyard, it had gone silent with a clean precision her engineers would have noticed if pride had not blinded the room first. Ellie placed her project on the table, cheeks pink with embarrassment. Mason stood behind her, quiet as a church at dawn. Cameras flashed around the shining prototype behind Charlotte. But beneath the rusted hood of Mason's $120 car sat a buried piece of technology Pierce Motors had been chasing for years. And before the night was over, the people laughing at that old machine would learn that sometimes the future does not arrive polished. Sometimes it rolls in covered with rust, carrying a father, a daughter, and a truth powerful enough to make an entire room go silent. 2 weeks before the cameras laughed at the old hatchback, Mason Walker found it behind Finch Salvage on the edge of Cedar Falls, Ohio, half hidden beneath weeds, rainwater, and a tarp that had given up years ago. The owner wanted $120 and an apology for the smell. Mason gave him exact cash from a folded envelope, then stood in silence while the man shook his head and said, "You are buying a headache." Mason ran one hand along the rusted fender, careful as a father touching a sleeping child. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe someone just stopped listening to it." By daylight, the car looked hopeless. The brown paint was blistered, the seats were torn, the floor mats smelled like wet leaves, and the dashboard had more cracks than the sidewalk outside his garage. But Mason was not looking at the paint. He was looking at the frame stamp near the driver's side rail, a faded sequence of numbers that made his breath slow and his past step out from the shadows. The last 4 digits matched a prototype shell he had not seen in 9 years, a test platform from a project people once called impossible. Walker Drive. His drive. His failure, if the newspapers were believed. His warning, if the truth ever mattered. He had designed it before Ellie was born, before grief narrowed his world, before investors learned how to smile while cutting safety from dreams. Back then, Mason believed machines should bring people home cleaner, cheaper, and safer. He believed a car could be rebuilt around mercy. Then men in suits demanded a faster launch, a cheaper system, a prettier lie. Mason refused. The project collapsed. Legal papers sealed the story, and his name disappeared from every conversation except the ones whispered by people who needed someone to blame. Now the rusted car sat in his garage beneath a hanging bulb, waiting like a witness no one had called to the stand. Every night after Ellie brushed her teeth and fell asleep under a quilt covered in yellow stars, Mason went downstairs and worked. He replaced corroded wiring. He cleaned the old battery bay. He rebuilt the thermal bridge by hand, one connection at a time, using parts from junk bins, closed factories, and favors from retired machinists who still remembered when American manufacturing felt like a promise. The garage smelled of metal dust, solder, coffee, and patience. Sometimes Ellie would appear at the stairs in her pajamas, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. "Daddy, are you fixing it or saving it?" she asked one night. Mason looked at the open hood, then at the little girl who still believed broken things deserved gentle answers. "Both, sweetheart." "Is it special?" He smiled, but the sadness behind it stayed. It was supposed to be. She came down and stood beside him, small feet cold on the concrete. "Then maybe it still is." That was how the science project began. Not as a plan to impress Pierce Motors. Not as a trick. Just a father teaching his daughter that old does not mean useless. Poor does not mean empty. And rust only tells you what weather has done, not what worth remains beneath it. By the time the scholarship invitation arrived from Pierce Motors, the hatchback still looked like a $120 mistake. Mason left it that way on purpose. He cleaned the engine, not the scars. He polished the truth, not the surface. Because somewhere deep in that quiet machine, a buried piece of his life was finally ready to move again. While Mason was rebuilding the old hatchback in the quiet hours of Cedar Falls, Charlotte Pierce was standing inside a glass conference room on the 32nd floor of Pierce Motors headquarters, watching her company lose faith in itself one spreadsheet at a time. The city of Columbus stretched beneath the windows in clean lines of traffic, steel, and morning light, but inside the room, everything felt colder. On the table were sales projections, warranty risk reports, investor letters, and a sealed technical review that no one wanted to say aloud. The new electric sedan looked perfect beneath showroom lights. It was smooth, elegant, and expensive, the kind of car meant to make reporters write words like future and revolution. But after 180 miles of highway testing in cold weather, the battery system lost efficiency faster than promised. After steep grade simulations, the thermal control became unstable. After repeated long-range trials, the numbers refused to obey the speeches. Charlotte stood at the head of the table in a navy suit, one hand resting near her emerald ring, her face still enough to make weaker people mistake discipline for calm. Derek Sloan sat 3 chairs down, tapping a silver pen against his folder. "We can still control the story," he said. "Delay the technical briefing, blame supply chain conditions, announce a strategic review." Charlotte did not look at him. A strategic review means sale preparation. It means survival. It means you want me to hand Pierce Motors to Horizon Global before the board discovers how bad your cost reductions were. The room went quiet. A younger engineer lowered his eyes. A legal advisor stopped typing. Derek smiled as if insult had passed over him without leaving a mark. "My reductions kept this company breathing." Charlotte turned toward him. "Your reductions removed the second safety layer from the thermal bridge. The old design was too expensive. The old design worked." Derek leaned back. "Then find me a better one before Friday." Friday was the public launch, the scholarship showcase, the investor demonstration, the night Charlotte had promised would restore confidence. She had grown up inside this company. Her grandfather had started Pierce Motors with 2 assembly bays and a belief that American families deserve cars built by people who cared. Her mother had carried it through recessions, strikes, and boardroom betrayals. Charlotte inherited the name, the factories, the debt, and the expectation that she would never bend. So she became sharp. She became polished. She learned to speak in numbers because numbers did not ask whether she was lonely. She learned to smile for cameras even when she had slept 3 hours. She learned that powerful women were forgiven for success only if they made it look effortless. That afternoon, after the board meeting ended, Charlotte remained alone by the window while the city moved below her. On the table, the failed test reports lay open like a confession. Her phone buzzed with another message from Derek. Horizon Global is ready. Do not let pride bury the company. She turned the emerald ring around her finger once, then stopped herself. Pride was not the thing burying Pierce Motors. Fear was. Fear of being the woman who lost a century-old American company. Fear of admitting that the brightest rooms in the industry had not solved the problem. Fear that the future she had sold to the world might not make it past the first hard winter. Across town, workers were hanging banners for the launch event. Reporters were preparing questions. Parents were helping children carry science boards into minivans. And in a small garage 70 miles away, a single father and his daughter were loading a cardboard display into a rusted car that looked worthless to people who only knew how to measure shine. Charlotte did not know his name yet. She did not know that the missing answer had already been rebuilt beneath a hood full of rust. She only knew that on Friday night, if Pierce Motors failed in front of the world, the silence would be louder than any applause she had ever chased. Ellie Walker carried her science display into the youth showcase room with both hands, the edges of the cardboard bending slightly where her fingers held too tight. Behind the glass wall, the launch party continued with bright music, polished shoes, and the soft thunder of important people congratulating one another before anything had been proven. Inside the smaller hall, folding tables were lined with student projects. Solar ovens made from pizza boxes, model bridges, water filters, wind turbines with paper blades, and neat handwritten labels that smelled faintly of markers and school glue. Ellie placed her board on table 12 and smoothed the title across the top with her palm. Mason stood a step behind her, close enough for courage, far enough to let the moment belong to her. You ready? He asked. Ellie looked toward the lobby where laughter had followed them like a stain. What if they think it is junk too? Mason crouched beside her, his voice low and steady. Then you tell them what it does, not what it looks like. She nodded, but her chin still trembled. A judge in a gray blazer approached with a tablet, followed by a young Pierce Motors engineer wearing a visitor badge and carrying a cup of coffee. The judge smiled politely, the kind of smile adults use when they expect a sweet explanation and not a surprise. And what did you build, young lady? Ellie straightened. It is a small energy recovery model based on my dad's car. The judge glanced past her toward the parking lot, where the rusted hatchback could be seen through the glass doors under the event lights. His smile thinned. Your father's car? A few parents nearby turned their heads. Mason said nothing. Ellie swallowed once and pressed a button on the wooden base. A tiny wheel assembly began to spin, then slowed, then recovered energy through a compact bridge circuit made of salvage parts, copper wire, and a repurposed temperature sensor. The small display meter lit up. The judge leaned closer, less polite now, more confused. Who helped you wire this? My dad showed me the safe parts, Ellie said. I did the layout. The young engineer stopped drinking his coffee. His eyes moved from the circuit to the hand-drawn diagram taped to the board. Wait, he said quietly. Why did you route the recovery load through the temperature gate before the storage cell? Ellie looked at Mason, then back at the engineer. Because if the system gets cold, the power should slow down before it hurts the whole car. The engineer set his cup down so quickly that coffee touched the rim. That is not how our junior kits teach it. Ellie shrugged with the honest simplicity of a child. Daddy said some kits teach cars to pass tests, not to bring people home. The words reached farther than anyone expected. Charlotte Pierce had entered the hall at that exact moment, escaping Derek's investors for 1 minute of quiet, and stopped near the doorway. She saw the engineer bend over the child's model, as if he had found a secret under a paper roof. She saw Mason standing behind his daughter with that same calm expression, not proud in the loud way, not defensive, simply present. What is your last name? The engineer asked. Walker, Ellie said. Ellie Walker. Charlotte's hand tightened around the event program. Walker. The name struck something buried under old reports, sealed reviews, and technical rumors that had haunted Pierce Motors long before she became chief executive officer. The engineer looked from Ellie to Mason, and his voice lowered with disbelief. Who exactly is your father? Mason gently placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder, not to stop her, but to steady the room around her. Just her dad, he said. That is enough for tonight. But Charlotte no longer believed it was enough. She remembered the rusted car that had gone silent with impossible precision. She remembered Derek laughing before looking. She remembered her own words, cold and careless, thrown at a machine she had not understood and a man she had not bothered to see. Across the hall, the silver prototype waited beneath bright lights, beautiful and flawed. On table 12, a child's salvaged model quietly solved the problem her company had spent millions failing to fix. And for the first time that evening, Charlotte Pierce stopped looking at Mason Walker as an embarrassment at her door and began wondering whether he was the answer she had mocked in public. The next morning, Charlotte Pierce drove to Cedar Falls without an assistant, without a press car, and without telling Derek Sloan where she was going. The highway out of Columbus opened into farmland, gas stations, church signs, and long two-lane stretches where the sky seemed wider than her calendar had ever allowed. Her white electric sedan moved silently past cornfields and old barns, but her mind kept returning to table 12, to Ellie Walker's careful voice, to the small meter lighting up on a model built from salvaged parts. She had spent millions chasing a solution, yet a little girl with marker on her fingers had explained the principle in one sentence. When Charlotte reached Walker Auto Service, she almost missed it. The garage sat beside a closed feed store, with 2 service bays, a faded sign, and a row of vehicles that looked less like inventory and more like neighbors waiting their turn. Mason was under the hood of a gray pickup when she arrived. Beside him stood an older man in a Pierce Motors work jacket, the kind issued at the Mansfield assembly plant before layoffs turned uniforms into memories. Mason tightened a clamp, checked the belt, then closed the hood with gentle finality. "Try it now, Frank." The older man turned the key. The engine started clean. Frank stared through the windshield for a moment before climbing out. "What do I owe you?" Mason wiped his hands on a towel. "Nothing today." Frank shook his head. "I cannot keep letting you do that. You trained half the line at Mansfield. Consider it interest." Charlotte stopped near the open bay door, unseen for one breath longer than comfort allowed. This was not charity performed for cameras. This was not branding. Mason did not look around to see who noticed. Frank's eyes were damp as he shook Mason's hand, and Charlotte felt something shift inside her, something quiet and inconvenient. Mason finally saw her. His expression did not harden, but it did close slightly, like a door left unlocked but not open. "Miss Pierce." "Mr. Walker." "Long drive for a follow-up question." "I have more than one." He nodded toward the office. "Coffee is old but honest." Inside, the room smelled of paper invoices, motor oil, and cinnamon gum. Ellie's science ribbon from the night before lay on the counter beside a jar of bolts. Charlotte touched the ribbon lightly. She should have won first place. Mason poured coffee into a chipped mug. She learned enough to keep building. "That is better. You talk as if prizes do not matter. They matter. They just should not become the reason a child starts measuring herself." Charlotte looked through the office window at the rusted hatchback parked in the side bay, hood closed, body still scarred by years of neglect. "What is in that car?" Mason set the mug down. "A lot of history." "That is not an answer. It is the safest one." Her jaw tightened. "My company is days away from signing itself into someone else's hands because our system cannot survive the cold grade tests. Your daughter's model uses a principle my engineers have not solved. Your car shuts down cleaner than anything in my fleet. So I will ask plainly, who are you?" Mason looked at her for a long moment, and the fluorescent light hummed above them like a held breath. "I am a father who fixes what he can. And before that," his eyes moved to the hatchback. "Before that, I trusted the wrong people with the right idea." The answer should have frustrated her, but the grief beneath it softened the edge of her pride. "Derek says people like you always want something." Mason gave a faint, sad smile. "People like Derek always think that because wanting is the only language they speak." Outside, Frank drove away in his repaired pickup, waving once through the window. Mason watched him go, then turned back to Charlotte. "Machines are not worth much if the people who build them cannot afford to get home safe." Charlotte had given speeches about workers, factories, and American legacy. Mason said one sentence and made all of hers feel rehearsed. She came to Cedar Falls looking for a secret under a rusted hood. What she found first was a man who carried responsibility without applause, and for the first time since becoming chief executive officer, Charlotte wondered whether leadership was not about standing above people at all, but standing close enough to notice when they were being left behind. Derek Sloan did not need to follow Charlotte to Cedar Falls to know where she had gone. Men like Derek built their power by studying absence, by noticing which elevator a person did not take, which call a person did not answer, which meeting a person left 5 minutes too early. By noon, a private investigator had sent him photographs of Charlotte standing inside Walker Auto Service, speaking with Mason near the rusted hatchback, as if the man mattered. Derek sat in his office at Pierce Motors headquarters, the city bright beyond the glass, and spread the photographs across his desk with the careful patience of someone arranging a trap. "So that is the miracle mechanic," he said softly. By 3 o'clock, he had more than pictures. Old files surfaced from sealed archives and forgotten databases. A failed clean vehicle project from 9 years earlier. A company called Walker Drive Systems. A confidential settlement. A technical review with half the conclusions missing. None of it told the whole truth, but Derek did not need the whole truth. He only needed pieces sharp enough to cut trust. That evening, Charlotte returned to Columbus and found him waiting outside her conference room with a folder in one hand and sympathy painted across his face. "You went to see him," Derek said. "This is not your concern. It is my concern if a stranger with a hidden past is circling my chief executive officer while our company is vulnerable." Charlotte reached for the folder, but he held it for 1 extra second, letting the silence do its work. "Be careful, Charlotte. Desperate people learn how to look noble." She opened the file. Mason Walker, founder. Walker Drive prototype failure. Investor loss. Disputed technical claims. Emergency injunction. Public withdrawal from the industry. Each page looked official enough to frighten and incomplete enough to accuse. Charlotte read without moving, but the emerald ring on her finger turned once, then twice. "Why was this sealed?" she asked. Derek gave a small shrug. "Because men with secrets usually pay to keep them quiet." Across town, Mason was closing the garage while Ellie taped her science ribbon above the office counter. The sunset outside Cedar Falls had softened the street into gold and long shadows. He had just turned the sign to closed when Charlotte's sedan pulled in hard enough to scatter gravel. Not reckless, only urgent. Ellie looked through the window. "Is Miss Pierce mad?" Mason watched Charlotte step out with the folder in her hand. "She is hurt," he said. "That is worse." Charlotte entered without greeting him. "You founded Walker Drive Systems." Mason looked at the folder, then back at her. "Yes. Your project failed. The public version did. Investors lost millions. Some did. And you disappeared." His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed low. "I chose my daughter." Charlotte placed the folder on the counter between them. "Do not give me half a sentence and call it truth." Ellie stood frozen near the ribbon, holding a strip of tape in both hands. Mason noticed and softened immediately. "Sweetheart, go upstairs." "But Daddy, please." Ellie looked at Charlotte, then at the folder, and her eyes filled before she turned toward the stairs. At the doorway, she heard Charlotte say, "Derek thinks you are using us." The words stopped the child like cold air. Mason saw her shoulders bend, and something in his face broke quietly. Not anger, not shame. A father realizing his silence had allowed his daughter to hear another person call him small. "Ellie," he said, but she was already gone. The stair door closed with a soft click that hurt more than a slammed one ever could. Charlotte's voice lowered. "Tell me what happened." Mason rested both hands on the counter, the same hands that had rebuilt machines and packed school lunches and held grief without applause. "Some machines can be rebuilt," he said. "Some trust cannot. That is not enough." "I know." Rain began tapping against the garage windows, gentle and steady. The rusted hatchback sat in the side bay, quiet under the fluorescent light, still looking like a mistake to anyone who did not know what had been saved beneath the scars. Mason finally looked toward it and spoke like a man opening a door he had sworn would stay closed. "They wanted the cheap version. I refused. The system they tested was not mine by the time it failed. I signed papers to protect Ellie from a fight I could not win then." Charlotte's eyes searched his face. "Can you prove that?" Mason turned off the office lamp, leaving only the bay light over the old car. "Tomorrow, Derek is hosting a private road test for investors." He picked up the hatchback keys from the workbench. "Let him bring his perfect machine. I will bring the truth." The Pierce Motors Proving Ground sat 40 miles outside Columbus, hidden behind a long private road, steel gates, and rows of winter-bare trees that made the place feel more like a courtroom than a test track. By 9 o'clock the next morning, investors stood beneath heated tents with paper cups of coffee, engineers checked laptops on folding tables, and reporters waited near the safety barrier with cameras pointed toward the oval track. At the center of it all gleamed the new Pierce electric sedan, silver, flawless, and expensive, its paint reflecting the pale Ohio sky like a promise already sold. Then Mason Walker arrived in the rusted hatchback with Ellie in the passenger seat, and the promise began to laugh at itself. The old car rolled through the gate with its mismatched bumper, faded brown doors, cracked rear trim, and little Science Club sticker still clinging to the glass. A few investors smiled behind their hands. One reporter whispered, "Is that part of the demonstration?" Derek Sloan stepped forward in a charcoal coat, looking pleased enough to seem generous. "Mr. Walker," he called, loud enough for every microphone to catch. "Thank you for bringing your historic artifact." A ripple of amusement moved through the crowd. Mason parked beside the silver sedan and shut off the hatchback. Its silence came clean and immediate, but no one noticed because they were too busy looking at the rust. Ellie sat very still, her hands folded over the science ribbon pinned to her jacket. "Daddy, maybe we should go." Mason looked at her, his voice calm and low. Not because they laughed. Charlotte Pierce stood near the timing station, her face composed but her eyes troubled. She had not slept much. The folder Derek gave her had raised questions, but Mason's grief had raised better ones. She watched him step out of the old car without swagger, without theater, carrying only a small diagnostic case and the dignity of a man who had already lost public approval once and survived. Derek lifted a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, before our official long-range demonstration, we have agreed to indulge a claim from Mr. Walker that his $120 vehicle contains a superior energy recovery system." He turned toward Mason with a smile that had no warmth in it. "We believe in innovation at Pierce Motors, even when it arrives with rust stains." The crowd laughed again. Mason did not. Charlotte moved toward Derek. "This is unnecessary." Derek lowered the microphone just enough to speak to her privately. "No, this is clarity. You wanted to know if he was real. Let him show us." Mason heard enough. He opened the hatchback hood. Instead of the tangled ruin everyone expected, the engine bay revealed a strange discipline. Clean wiring, restored shielding, handmade brackets, and a compact drive system that looked old only to people who confused age with failure. The younger engineer from the showcase stepped closer, his mouth slightly open. "That layout," he whispered, "it should not fit in that frame." Derek noticed the shift and quickly raised his voice. "The rules are simple. One cold-grade efficiency loop, one controlled incline simulation, one recovery cycle. Pierce prototype first, then the rust bucket." Ellie flinched at the words. Charlotte saw it and turned sharply toward Derek. "Do not call it that again." The crowd quieted, surprised less by her words than by the feeling behind them. Mason looked at Charlotte for one brief second, and something passed between them that was not romance, not yet, but respect trying to stand up in a room built to crush it. The silver sedan took the track first, smooth and graceful. At mile 12, the data looked acceptable. At mile 19, the efficiency began to fall. At the incline simulation, the thermal warning blinked amber on the engineer's screens. No disaster, no spectacle, only the quiet failure of numbers refusing to lie. Derek's jaw tightened. "Environmental fluctuation," he said. "Within range." Mason said nothing. He helped Ellie out of the passenger seat and handed her earmuffs, though the old car barely made a sound. Before he climbed in, Derek stepped close enough for the cameras to see both men. Last chance to withdraw with dignity. Mason rested one hand on the roof of the hatchback. Dignity does not withdraw because pride is uncomfortable. Then he looked down the track, toward the curve, the incline, the measuring lights, and the crowd waiting to mock what they did not understand. Do not judge the road by the dust on the tires. The old car started with a low, clean hum, soft as breath in a quiet chapel. The laughter stopped before the wheels even moved. The rusted hatchback moved onto the track with the kind of quiet that made people lean forward without knowing why. It did not leap. It did not roar. It simply rolled. By noon, The proving ground no longer felt like a test facility. It felt like a room after confession, open, quiet, and unable to return to what it had been. Derek Sloan stood near the monitors with his coat buttoned, his jaw tight, and no speech left polished enough to save him. The board members had gathered around the data station, reading the original design logs, the cost reduction memos, the removed safety notes, and the chain of decisions that had almost buried Pierce Motors beneath its own pride. Charlotte Pierce did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She looked at Derek with a stillness that made every camera hesitate. You recommended the cheaper design after knowing why the original safeguards mattered. Derek tried to smile. Every company makes difficult decisions. Charlotte shook her head. No. Honest companies make difficult decisions. Careless companies hide them. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was final. Within the hour, the board placed Derek on administrative leave pending a full review, and for once he walked away without applause, without followers, without the power to turn another person into a headline. Mason watched from beside the old hatchback, one hand resting on the roof, the other holding Ellie close. He felt no joy in seeing a man exposed. Justice, he had learned, was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes it was simply the moment truth stopped being afraid. Charlotte approached him slowly, her heels clicking against the cold pavement, her face stripped of every executive mask she had worn for years. I owe you an apology, she said. Mason looked at her, calm but tired. You owe one to my daughter first. Charlotte turned to Ellie, then crouched so they were eye to eye. The powerful woman from the stage, the woman who had mocked a poor man's car beneath bright lights, now spoke softly to a child in a ribboned jacket. Ellie, I was wrong. I judged something important before I understood it, and I made you feel small when your work deserved respect. I am sorry. Ellie studied her for a long second, then nodded with the careful mercy only children can give when adults finally tell the truth. Daddy says people can be rebuilt too. Charlotte looked up at Mason, and her eyes filled. Your father is a wise man. Mason did not ask for a title, a corner office, or revenge money. When Pierce Motors offered to buy Walker Drive outright, he refused the first contract and wrote his own terms on a yellow legal pad in the conference trailer. The Mansfield assembly line would reopen with local workers first. No safety layer could ever be removed for cost savings. A technical scholarship would be funded every year for children from working families. And Ellie's youth STEM program would become a permanent Pierce Motors initiative across Ohio. Charlotte read the terms, then signed without changing a word. 3 months later, the old Mansfield plant opened its doors under a clear spring sky. Former workers walked back through the gates carrying lunch pails, coffee, and quiet disbelief. Reporters came for the technology, but they stayed for the people. Mason stood beside the rusted hatchback near the entrance, still refusing to paint over every scar. Charlotte stood beside him in a simple navy coat. No spotlight needed, no speech rehearsed. Ellie climbed into the passenger seat and placed a small handmade sticker on the dashboard. Not junk, just waiting. Charlotte touched the rusted hood gently, as if greeting an old witness. I used to think value had to shine, she said. Mason smiled faintly. Most people do, until life teaches them where to look. The first factory whistle sounded across Mansfield for the first time in years, and workers paused beneath the American flag as the production lights came on. No one laughed at the old car now. No one called Mason a failure. No one looked at Ellie's project like a child's game. The silence that filled the plant was deep, warm, and full of grace, the kind of silence that arrives when dignity has outlasted mockery, when truth has risen from rust, and when the world finally understands that some things are not broken. They are simply waiting for someone with enough respect to see what is still alive inside.